Hello and welcome to Chile Talk, a series of shortish videos about life as it is lived in contemporary Chile. I'm Neil Davidson, newspaper columnist here in Chile, long-term resident. This is Pete Lee, a student of all things Chilean.
A Chilenista.
A Chilenista, that's right. Giving it a faintly political turn this time. And our topic today is speaking Spanish in Chile, which of course we both have had to do. And one question is, what is the proper name of the language in Spanish? Because you can call it either Castellano or Español.
Yes, I mean, it's an interesting question. Of course, the Spanish language is derived from Castilian, Castellano. Traditionally, it's called Castellano. In recent times, there's been more and more influence from a couple of sources to call it instead Español, Spanish. One of the sources is the nationalist promotion of the idea that Spain has a national language, obviously during the Franco years. And also the use in Mexico of Español.
So this is rather similar to the way to the British. A Scotsman looks very different from an Englishman, and we know that there are Welsh speakers out there, but to somebody looking from the States, it's just like one big lump and it's all British.
Yes.
So we've always called it Spanish, except for a few pedants have always called it Castilian. But if you're living in the Iberian Peninsula, things could look quite different, especially if you're Catalan or something.
It can be a bit of a shibboleth of your politics here as well. A lot of schools traditionally maintain the idea that we speak Castilian.
Right. Others
see it as a modernizing move, more in keeping with the dominant usage on television, to call it Español.
Español. And so you mentioned Mexico, and I rather broke in. You're saying there's a Mexican influence here?
Yes, I mean, standard Latin American Spanish is heavily influenced by Mexican films, Mexican
dubbing of American shows.
Yes, and the idea of a neutral Latin American is a very Mexican concept.
Yeah, you can take it from us that there's no such thing. You know, there is no accepted neutral Latin American Spanish.
Yes, actually, it's so controversial here in Chile that the education department doesn't use Español and it doesn't use Castellano. Instead, it uses lenguaje, language.
You think that's because of this controversy, or have they always done that? Do you know?
I think it's a highly divisive topic, and over recent decades, they've decided that lenguaje is the most neutral term.
Of course. So what we would call your English class, they just call your language class, and they avoid naming it.
Yes. Now, when and how did you learn Spanish, Neil? Because you seem to be pretty good at it.
Well, I learnt it here in Chile. I did a degree in French and Italian in the UK, and I came here because I'd met someone, my future wife, and before I came I learnt the verb endings, because I knew that when you learn a new Latin language, that's really the first thing to master. And if you already know other Latin languages, everything else will follow pretty quickly. But the verb endings are different. So I learnt the verb endings, and I arrived at the house of my future wife. She was having a meeting, as she always did every Thursday, of a group of literary and artistic friends. And I arrived essentially speaking Italian, but with Spanish verb endings.
Chileans will often understand Italian.
Oh, absolutely. They're perfectly mutually comprehensible. No, not perfectly. You would have to speak fairly slowly, whatever. But in fact, my Italian wasn't that good. I remember reading Manzone's The Betrothed in Italian at university, or a bit later, and really struggling with it. I didn't really read any Italian books again until after I'd been in Chile for some time, had learned Spanish, and then I picked up the Manzoni, and it was a complete breeze. From learning Spanish, my Italian had improved out of all recognition.
Yes.
That's how close they are, you know. And so I was seated at a table, and there was a social group there, and everybody was talking, and I was trying to understand. And at the end of it, I was subjected everybody else went home, and I was subjected to an interrogation by some curious friends of my future wife's, who are quite well-known people now. They weren't then. Rafael Gumucio, he's a well-known writer, and Patricio Fernandez, one of the founders of the clinic. This was all in the future. They were losers with all the time in the world then to interrogate a visiting Englishman. And they interrogated me for about 3 hours. And I think by the end of those 3 hours, I was pale as a sheet. I'd just arrived on the rather long flight from the UK. But I think I'd actually learnt Spanish. It was the most intensive learning process I've ever had in my life. So that's how I learnt Spanish. And so I've been speaking it for some time now. I arrived a long time ago. What's your story?
Well, I guess somewhat similar. I learned Latin at university. I taught myself Latin prior to beginning university. Not that I was particularly good at Latin, and I've always been interested in the Romance languages, I guess, in general.
Right.
All languages I'm interested in. And I remember the first things that I read in Spanish were poems by Garcia Lorca. I'm a big Leonard Cohen fan, and Leonard Cohen's hero is Garcia Lorca.
I didn't know that. Okay.
He named his daughter Lorca. And I remember getting a bilingual edition of many of Lorca's poems and making sense of the Spanish just based on my Latin.
Yep.
Then, when I was doing a doctorate in Melbourne, I had a Chilean friend, and we began to write together, both in English and in Spanish. So I began to learn on a really text-oriented basis, which obviously is not the best way to learn a language.
Right.
But it's what I was trained in through Latin. And when I arrived in Chile, I didn't speak anything. I was very comfortable with written texts, and the process of learning orally with my ears has been a challenge.
So also another difficulty maybe is that I arrived quite a long time ago. My first trip was in 1995. At that time, very few people spoke English. So you could have pretty poor Spanish and you could converse with somebody and they wouldn't interrupt you usually to try and speak English, to try and practice their English. Whereas that's changed a bit now, hasn't it?
That has changed, hasn't it? Hasn't it? I mean, people do like to practice their English. Many people have either a desperate need to practice their English or an inflated opinion of their English. And also, people are not necessarily accustomed to people speaking Spanish aberrantly.
Or even quite well. I mean, I have to admit, I do get offended. I think my Spanish is pretty good. I have a strong accent, so it quite annoys me when I'm talking to somebody in Spanish and they will break in English as though I were kind of mentally defective and had to be coached along in my own language,
Yes. Well, I have a separate problem. I try to imitate, I think, some of the omissions that happen phonologically in Chilean Spanish. People don't pronounce the final letter S or R or D.
That's right. A final S. Chilean Spanish seems to derive mainly from Andalusian and Canary Island Spanish, I think, as well.
A couple of generations in the Canaries before it got here. Not very much. Yes.
Right, because it's very striking if you tune into a flamenco program and listen to the flamenco singers speak, or indeed sing. It's very similar to Chilean Spanish, and they do the same thing. They swallow the final S's and they turn them into kind of something like an H. They kind of slightly aspirate them.
Yes.
Now they consider this, all the ones I've spoken to, as a bad thing. Chileans think they speak Spanish badly, don't they?
Yes.
Or they say so, and I believe them. I believe they really think this.
It seems to be a widely held belief that Chileans speak badly.
Essentially because they don't speak it the way it's spelt.
No.
Yeah.
And perhaps there's a certain national pride in as much as there are comic books in Chile, historietas. There's not so many, but those that there are emphasize the Chilean pronunciation patterns from the middle of last century anyway.
That's right.
Which means dropping a lot of letters.
That's right.
This also happens in Argentinian Spanish quite similarly.
That's right. Now, I have found, alongside this saying, "Oh, we speak Spanish badly," Chileans, tend to be quite pleased and proud about all their local terms that other Latin Americans and Spanish speakers don't understand.
Yes, and there are a few. I don't think there are terribly many, though. And more and more there are.
There's a lot, right? There's a lot that in the dictionary will say Southern Cone rather than Chile.
Yes.
Yeah.
And also there's a lot of cross-pollination now between Northern South American and Mexican Spanish and Southern Cone Spanish.
Right, because of films, TV, and whatever, all social media now. Yes, that's right. Now, it's very interesting, this thing. I think about Chileans thinking they speak badly. Like I say, I can only think it's because Chileans also that Peruvians speak well. Those are the model. The Peruvians speak well. Not the Mexicans, not the Argentinians. And I think the reason is that Peruvians do actually speak Spanish the way it's written. In fact, to my ear, they speak Spanish as though it were a foreign language. And so do Mexicans. It sounds as if it were a foreign language.
Well, I think certainly in the Peruvian case, and perhaps to some extent in the Mexican case as well, you've got to remember that for a long time, Spanish was a second language and a prestige language.
That's it.
For people who spoke Quechua or Aymara, or in the case of Mexico, Nahuatl.
And this is the feeling I still get, that you have a Peruvian or a Mexican, and possibly they don't even know any Quechua or whatever, or Nahuatl or whatever, indigenous language, but they talk as though that were their native language and they were still speaking Spanish as a second language, which is certainly not the case to my ear in Chile. It sounds totally native. It is their language, for sure.
It's totally native. A very interesting event in Chilean history was the arrival of the Venezuelan genius, really, Andrés Bello. Basically, just when Chile was getting organised, all of the South American and Latin American countries became organised over a number of decades after formal independence. Chile was fairly early in organising itself, and in 1829, Andrés Bello, a Venezuelan who had been working basically as a diplomat for Venezuela, what had become Venezuela, Gran Colombia originally, but in London for 18 or 19 years, a brilliant man really, was recruited by the Chilean Conservative government. Right. And this was just when the Chilean Conservatives were about to defeat any liberal upper class tendencies in the First Civil War. The sands of Leihy, 1829, 1830.
Right.
Bello arrived and he decided, having lived in London for 18 years, and being Venezuelan, which has always had a stronger connection both to the Canaries and Spain.
A lot of this is new to me as well.
Yes. He arrived here and he decided that the Chileans couldn't really speak Spanish to his taste.
I see.
And he put about many projects trying to educate the Chileans. He was actually involved in the reorganization. He was the first rector of the reorganized Universidad de Chile, and he wrote a grammar of the Castilian language for Latin Americans, which is a very influential text to this day. And he had strong opinions about what Spanish ought to be. He influenced the idea of a normal school, a pedagogical training.
What's called a escuela normal here in Spanish.
Standard pedagogical training with a standard accent for all Chileans. So Chilean regional accents are fairly limited now.
Yes, it's pretty hard to tell where somebody comes from the accent.
Yes. The problem with Bello's project is very normative, which is a very Latin American and particularly Chilean indulgence,
Right.
and did not necessarily describe the reality. So I think Chileans have a kind of deficit modelling of their language. They see it as not entirely living up to Andres Bello's expectations.
Or to put it a different way, they put the cart before the horse. They admire Peruvian Spanish because if you listen to Peruvian and you follow the words, written down, they are the same letters being pronounced in the same order. And a Chilean Spanish is not, it misses out letters and so on. And they have forgotten that in fact the written word follows the spoken word. And that writing should reflect the way you speak. And they think speaking should reflect the way you write.
Yes.
And this is, and I suppose the logical conclusion of that would be that Chile would have to have its own spelling, of course, which would be an absurdity because it is the same Spanish as everybody else speaks. It's just a different emphasis and different accent.
Well, in the comic book Condorito, Chilean does have its own spelling, and more and more in the graffiti, Chilean has its own spelling.
Very true. Very true.
Which is interesting.
That's right. So that is a kind of populist, or shall we say, folk countervailing force against this thing which I think you're telling us that Andres Bello was partly responsible for. Though of course it's very strong in all Latin cultures. It's a kind of Napoleonic sort of prescriptive thing. This idea that there's a correct way of speaking, and if you don't follow it, then you're simply wrong. And Chileans have really taken this on board.
Yes, and it's an extreme experience if you're coming from English, where we have no National Academy of Language,
no official dictionary. And of course you've got the Royal Academy Spanish Dictionary, which is considered an authority. And when the Royal Academy said that the word solo, meaning only, is henceforth not to be written with an accent, which was a foolish decision in my opinion, because it distinguished it from the adjective alone.
This old hobby horse, Neil.
And there was apparently a reason for it. They were sued by somebody. The Royal Academy, the Spanish Academy, was actually sued by somebody to oblige them by law to remove the accent from solo. I do not know the full details. I'll get them for a future episode actually. But that gives you a little flavour, I think, of the Spanish language and approaches to it.
Yeah, that's where we're coming from with Spanish. And we're going to reshoot this in Spanish.
Of course we are, and see what the reaction is.
Which will be interesting.
I hope there is one. Okay, thank you for listening, and I hope you tune in again.
Thanks.